when history unfolds in a spiral. Another thing, as a kind of analytical and evaluative observation, is that it is often said that history tends to repeat itself as a farce. When it repeats itself, this can be seen in many different ways. But the fact that the current situation is extremely serious is far from being a farce. Because despite all the outward signs of a farce, and they are really present, I believe that many understand that the consequences of what our American colleagues are doing, in this specific case together with the Israelis, are extremely serious. They will resonate in the world for a very long time from now on.
There's a question I've wanted to ask for a long time. Tell me, they talk about Russian diplomatic art. Could you tell me what that means today? Is there supposed to be some kind of art in that?
Yes, there is. First of all, everything is written in our doctrinal documents, in the very concept of foreign policy. The main task is to work to defend our national interests, with respect for the interests of others, with respect for countries that are willing to cooperate with us on the basis of equality and mutual respect, and to seek a balance precisely between these interests, something that the West deeply lacks. And especially now, we see how the Trump administration openly declares that they will not recognize any international law. We have our own morals, we have our own instincts, and those are what we are going to follow. That's why national interests, mutual respect, understanding, the willingness and ability to understand your partners or your counterparts' legitimate approaches, and of course pragmatism, are important. Diplomacy, just like politics, all politics, is the art of the possible.
Everyone finds it interesting that negotiations take place behind closed doors and how that happens. What does the art consist of? In getting inside your counterpart's head and understanding them, or in doing something, anything? I'll reveal a little secret.
Well, you know, there isn't a general rule for that. And what does the art consist of? Yes, each negotiation is individual. They depend to a large extent, if not decisively, on the personalities of the participants in the negotiation. How experienced are these people? How much do they have? The qualities that, in this case, we value, especially in the Russian diplomatic service. Excellent command of language, foreign languages, knowledge of history, knowledge of the regions, of the areas of the world, of the countries you are dealing with and that you are discussing. In this situation, North American dealers, Americans. As a rule, these qualities are not mandatory. I'll put it this way, they like them. We had a subject called regional studies when a person was being prepared for diplomacy, through a deep dive into that country, into the history, the culture, the region that the person would be dealing with. In the diplomatic service with the Americans, everything is different. Then, in our case, the person will work abroad, usually for about 5 years. This allows them to adapt, understand the context, and produce results in the form of recommendations and ideas. It's a relatively long period. For Americans, it's 2 to 3 years, and then the person is transferred. They can be moved from Indonesia to Congo, then to Guatemala, and so on. That's their old tradition, and it's a distinctive feature of their diplomatic service. We treat them with respect, but for productive negotiations, of course, it's very important to understand the subject. Especially when discussing such deep issues with a history of decades or even centuries. Like, for example, the issues of the Middle East, in the Middle East. Simply making hasty decisions like, I propose this here, let's go, accept it before it's too late, that's never going to work.
This is happening in the world now. It seems like it has happened before, and we're just following the same pattern, as Michael said. We evolve, and every now and then we see such madness. Or is this something new that has emerged? Well,
does history develop in a spiral? Another, at such a decisive moment, said that history repeats itself as a farce. When it repeats itself, it can be faced in different ways. But what is happening now is serious. It's far from being a farce, because despite all the outward signs of farce, which do exist, I believe many people understand this. The consequences of what our American colleagues are doing, in this case together with the Israelis, are extremely serious and will still have repercussions for a very, very long time. And in general, we see. This is a stage of our history that returns in a spiral. But it makes us go back to a world where there was absolutely no kind of international law, no Versailles system, no Yalta system, absolutely none of that. A world where brute force ends up dictating the law. Force is the truth. But for us, as you know, God is not in force but in truth, as the famous character from a well-known movie once said. But now look at what's happening. The United States has officially declared that they don't take orders from anyone, that they only care about their own interests. Well-being, that's what it's all about. They are ready to defend it by any means. Coup d'etat, assassination of leaders of those countries that have the natural resources the Americans need, or kidnappings like this one. And as for Venezuela and Iran, our American colleagues don't even hide that the real reason is because of the oil. They have a doctrine of domination in the global energy markets. Here are Lukoil and Rosneft. They were sanctioned. These are already the first major sanctions from the Trump administration, not a legacy from Biden. They cut Europe off categorically. Look, the Nord Stream pipelines. A long time ago, when the Nord Stream pipelines were being built, the Americans argued that Europe should give them up. But now it happened that Europe was deprived of the Nord Stream pipelines, and Germany was humiliated. As in fact everyone understands this. But what is the result? Now the Hungarians and the Slovaks are fighting with all their strength, defending their interests to maintain cheap and accessible energy sources as the engine of their economies. And they are told no, buy at double the price because Russia needs to be punished. But this is not an appropriate approach to international relations. This is clearly an attempt to bring back the colonial era. When Europe, which is behind all of this now, tries to coerce and force Hungary, Slovakia, and any other dissenter to simply obey blindly those who rule in Brussels without ever having been elected by anyone, unlike the legitimate national governments. Europe, which for 500 years ruled the entire world, and in its time, colonialism in the era of slavery, and now tries to consolidate neocolonialism in the world. It still wants to live at the expense of others and dictate everything to everyone. This excessive arrogance, the contempt for everyone else, that's something that, frankly, sorry, but it just overflows from today's European politicians when they start trying to give moral lessons. Well, and the United States supported and still support the marginalization of Russia in the European energy markets. And in Serbia, they are being expelled. Now it's the Americans. Biden is making his contribution. Trump started it, and now it's being finished. This is a completely open claim of domination. The ultimate goal is energy domination over the entire world in every region. And that's why when our American colleagues tell us, well, let's solve the Ukraine issue now, even though we were already ready for that back in Alaska, but now they are starting to waver somehow. But they say, let's solve this, see where it's still possible to make concessions, and then we'll have huge economic prospects together. And at the same time, exactly what I just described to you is happening. We are being pushed out of all global energy markets, and then only our own territory will be left. The Americans will come to us, and we will be open to cooperating with them. But if we are willing to carry out mutually beneficial projects on our territory, we can probably also offer the Americans what interests them. Taking our own interests into account, then probably our interests, besides Russian resources, should also be respected. For now, we don't see that happening. That's why this is an unusual situation. It's a return to a time when there were no limits in international relations. It was stated directly and clearly. The interests of the United States are above any international agreements.
Sergei, are we facing a generation that will disappear, or have we already crossed some kind of limit?
You know, I'm not an astrologer and I'm not a fortune teller either.
One last question. Russian diplomacy was once mainly focused on Europe, then on the United States. And now?
Well, since the days of the old Russian Empire, it was already well known that we only have two true allies, our army and our navy. But now, of course, we also have the aerospace forces. We can't ignore them. And now we also have new and modern unmanned aerial vehicle units, so the number of our allies is increasing. But the main conclusion from our long thousand-year history is that we must trust in God, but not stop doing our own part. And this is also very important. You can only trust in God, but you shouldn't relax. Of course, we should count on allies, on people who think like us. We should help them. You need to receive with gratitude the support they offer you, as for those who have deceived you more than once. Well, biblically speaking, it's also necessary to build relationships, starting from the principle that these are not people you can trust. That's why the president has already said more than once, the weak get beaten, that's all. Actually, you have to be strong. Russia is a very strong country, strong in spirit, the strongest country in natural resources, in its scientific potential. We just need to be able to turn all of this into technologies that are at the highest level today. In fact, as the president said, whoever is the leader in the field of artificial intelligence will be the leader in the world. We want our diplomacy to help create the conditions to achieve exactly these results, as defined by Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin.